The studio door was never locked. My name is Asher, and the first lie I told about Nico was that he wasn't a risk. He moved into the space next to my studio at the co-op on Rivington, one of those old brick buildings whose windows sweat in July and whose pipes gossip in winter. I do sound design for indie films and art installations. Nico paints, or says he paints, but mostly he rearranges silence until it looks expensive. He wears the kind of white t-shirts that make a man feel insufficient, and he keeps late hours that make a neighbor think. I am not single. I live 8 blocks away with Julian, who takes photographs like he's negotiating with light. We've been together 5 years. He has a shoulder I've cried into and a mouth I've lied to exactly twice. We keep a notepad on our fridge that says say in daylight. We do not always do what it says. The first time I went into Nico's studio was because of a leak. The ceiling over my console had developed a slow insult, and the super, who owes everyone apologies, said the landlord would be here tomorrow. Tomorrow did the thing it likes to do. Water is a sound designer's enemy. It gets into everything and believes it belongs. I knocked on Nico's door to ask if he was getting the same problem. He opened it with paint on the inside of his wrist and the kind of smile that has a parenthetical. "Come look," he said, stepping back. The room smelled like linseed oil and something citrus that wasn't from a bottle. He had 3 canvases against the far wall, nothing on them but a mood. The leak ran through a seam in the plaster like a thin untruth. He reached up and pressed his palm against the stain, a gesture that could have been about water or anything else. "I've been putting down towels. It likes attention." He spoke about attention the way a person speaks about oxygen. He asked what I did. I told him I make rooms honest and liars tolerable. He laughed. "We're in the same trade," he said, and then, "You always work this late," I said sometimes. He said, "Stay and have a drink," and I did because the leak felt like permission and I was tired of being married to the practical. Julian doesn't drink much. He doesn't like how his tongue volunteers opinions after midnight. Nico poured vodka into glasses that looked like stolen hotel property and watched me the way a room watches a secret. We stood too close to the open window, letting the street lift our hair like a dare. He asked about the film I was finishing, the one about a woman who disappears into a neighborhood's attention span, and I told him how we built her footsteps like a rumor. He leaned against the sill and said, "I know how to disappear into an angle. I shouldn't, it works." The second lie I told about Nico was that we were careful. Careful implies an attempt at mercy. We were precise, which is worse. He touched the back of my hand with the back of his like a toast that forgot the glasses. I put my mouth against his throat at the pulse and remembered the better version of myself who leaves the studio on time. He pressed me against the wall where the leak had been and said my name the way you say please without wanting permission. The wall was warm and so was he. It did not feel like a mistake. That was the first mistake. Julian is a morning person. He makes the coffee before the city decides what mood it will have. He photographs the light through our kitchen blind like it's a thesis. The day after Nico's first lesson in revisionism, I came home as the sun was doing that thing where it forgives anybody. I put my keys down quietly because I had nothing to hide. That's another lie people tell when they're full. He kissed me with coffee breath and asked how the flood had gone. I said, "Managed," and the word felt defensive. He asked me to listen to a sequence he'd cut. Subway, shoe, stair, door. And we stood in our living room for a long time pretending to talk about rhythm. Nico became a word on the back of my teeth. I saw him in the hallway and the hallways got ideas. He started sending me pictures of nothing, the corner of a canvas with a fingerprint I wanted to know, the inside of his wrist where a vein wrote a note, the couch with a divot that could have been anyone. I answered with sounds, a door latch closing, a breath as it makes a decision, a laugh with teeth in it. I told myself that the body is an instrument with a temper, and I was just learning how to tune mine. The body, like a good instrument, punishes metaphors. Julian's show opened in an old bank with marble floors that believed in echoes. The theme was waiting rooms. He had photographs of people mid-breath, a woman undoing her scarf, a man looking at his watch like a mirror that lied less. I stood beside him while people said phrases like the ethics of light and tried not to find a corner to stand in alone. Nico came. He kissed my cheek. It felt like a crime committed in broad day without a gun. He told Julian he admired his work, which was true and a transgression I had not anticipated. He told me later in the bathroom where the paper towels were too soft that I should leave sooner. The hand dryer purred its judgment. I used to think sex was like a switch, on-off. Nico taught me it is more like a fader, slow and cruel. He liked to put his thumb at the hinge of my jaw and study his own choices. He liked the thin line of hair down my stomach and the way my back learns and forgets. He liked the kind of talk that sounds like it means more than it says. He said, "You're good at staying quiet in the right places," and then, "Say my name when you stop pretending." He would pull away a second before I asked because he liked the shape of the question in my mouth. I liked the question. That was another problem. Julian has a friend named Marla who does podcasts about cities and the ghosts that live inside their zoning laws. She asked me to design her new season sound. I said yes because I say yes to work the way some men say yes to confession. Nico critiqued the draft like he lived inside it. He said, "You built a church and never left the vestibule." And then he touched me like he had the keys. I told him my worst stories and he told me his best lies. We were matching talents. The first time the hotel email hit our joint account with my name on the same day, it wasn't mine. It was a delivery notice for a print Julian had ordered from a friend moving cities. When the second email hit, a week later, I was at Nico's with my hand on his throat and his hand on the small of my back, and the idea of ignorance felt like a mercy I hadn't earned. It said, "Thank you for your stay, Dunham House." Time, 12:023:01. Points, 200 added. Who? I asked. He looked at me with his mouth on my mouth, and that was an answer. I told myself I could carry every kind of voltage until I couldn't. The next day, I went home early and found Julian naked but not alone. I had expected a person. I was not prepared for a version of myself. Luca, the photographer from the magazine pieces we'd both admired, stood at our kitchen counter with the confidence of someone who thinks he's a better mirror. Julian looked guilty like a light does, which is to say it pretended innocence while making everything visible. He said my name in a tone that meant apology, then argument, then please. Luca buttoned his shirt with grace. I put my hand on the refrigerator like I wanted to tilt it. The notepad said say in daylight. It was noon. Apparently that still counts. "Do you want to talk?" Julian asked. "Or do you want to be angry first?" I said, "I want you to tell me if you're going to love him." I don't know where that sentence came from, but I can hear the room it was recorded in. He said, "I don't know yet," which was a lie generous and unforgivable. Luca excused himself with a handshake like a man who would steal your ring and then compose a poem about its hue. When he left, the apartment inflated by 2 breaths. We stood there like men in a photograph who didn't know the camera was already done with them. Julian said the thing men say when they think they're brave. "We could try an arrangement," he said. "People do. People also move to Connecticut and buy nicer coffee tables," I said. "We aren't people." That night I went to Nico and let him make me forget the shape of my name. He was careful and then he wasn't, and the ratio felt like a confession. Afterward he lay on his back and said, "You're going to forgive him," as if it were board trivia. I turned my face to the wall and hated the paint for its patience. I avoided home for 3 days. I slept on a studio couch that had ambitions it could not support. Nico brought me coffee and a joke about hydration. Julian texted, talk, and then, I'll be here, and then nothing. I woke at 3 every morning and walked the block like it had answers in the gutter. The city watched with its arms crossed. The river sounded like a long sentence that could end any way it wanted. On the 4th day, Luca called me. He had the fearlessness of someone who doesn't believe in consequences and said, "If you want him, you should fight correct, not loud." I said, "Why are you calling me?" He said, "Because he told me he loved you even while learning me, and I hated the grammar but not the message." I thanked him because I didn't know what else to do. Nicely phrased, mercy is still mercy. I went home. Julian had cleaned the kitchen like a ritual. He'd put away the print he ordered. He'd left a note on the table in handwriting that makes me forgive my parents for nomming me after a minor prophet. I slept on the sofa so I could practice deserving you. I stood looking at the note so long the paper had time to remember being a tree. We sat in the living room and I told him about Nico. He looked at me like a man watching a bridge he trusts carry a truck he doesn't. He asked how many times. I told him twice that counted and too many that didn't. He asked if I wanted to stop. I said yes and hated him for believing me. He said he'd end it with Luca. He said he already had. He said we could try something like monogamy with daylight. He said we could try something like honesty with mercy. He is good at sentences. I drew a line on a page. I labeled one end your rules and the other mine. We filled the space with nouns: doors, phones, truths, strangers, sleep. We added verbs carefully. We decided to try and mean it for a month. Try is contemptible and holy. We practiced. Nico did not practice. He texted a photograph of his mouth half smiling, then nothing. He waited. He is good at waiting the way a cat is good at falling asleep while judging you. I blocked his number and learned how to miss a person who is another yourself. Julian learned how to trust a person who is not yet who he promises to be. It is a kind of sex. The last time I saw Nico was at an opening for a man we both called a painter because no better word existed for what he did to walls. The room smelled like money forgiving itself. Nico stood beneath a canvas that used red like a dare and looked at me like a door left ajar. He said, "You look steady," which meant, "Are you bored yet?" I said, "I look busy," which meant, "I am trying not to be a person you recognize." He put his fingers against my wrist where the pulse keeps its calendar and said, "You know where I live." I said, "We both do." I didn't go. That night Julian and I did something terrible and honest. We made love like men who were choosing not to leave. It wasn't pretty. It was need and apology and the kind of kiss that wants to rename everything. He told me where he was terrified. I told him where I was fragile. We took turns being careful. He pressed his mouth against the hinge of my jaw and said my name like a weather report. I held his shoulders like the first tool that never failed. We fell asleep in the middle of a sentence about breakfast. People ask me how we know if we're fixed. We are. We are accurate. I still walk past the co-op and listen for Nico's laugh. Julian still keeps Luca's print in a flat file labeled future so he can blame the label later. We still write on the notepad on the fridge. Yesterday Julian wrote, "Speak the hard thing before the hard thing speaks you." I wrote, "Keep the shoreline where you can see it." The magnet did its job. At work, I explained to a producer who thinks she is a director why the band needs another 2 feet, and why the light cannot come from the floor unless everyone wants to look like a documentary about mistakes. A woman in a black dress asks me if the stage can be more intimate, and I tell her that's a negotiation you do with yourself. The bartender says he likes my tie. I consider cheating with him because he said something kind without expecting change. I go home instead. At noon today I stood in our kitchen, looking at the small piece of paper on our table that taught us the word enough. I thought about rooms and the men who decide what happens in them. I thought about the door to Nico's studio and why it was never really locked. I thought about the lock on our own and the key we don't always trust ourselves to carry. When Julian came in, smelling like the inside of a camera, I said, "I want you now," with no adjectives. He said, "Okay," like the answer to a question everyone was tired of asking. Outside, a siren tried to make the day about itself and failed. Somewhere a generator started and remembered its purpose. Downriver, a tug leaned into its burden and the barge agreed to move. If you want the intrigue as proof, the ache as punctuation, the unzipping as answer, listen. I am telling you the sex was bright and the betrayal was not the point. The point was choosing to be men who don't mistake heat for light again. The point was noticing that the room smelled like oranges because Julian had decided it should, that his mouth knew its way back to mine, that the afternoon put its hand on the window and said good, finally good. We are not forgiven. We are ongoing. Some nights the magnet fails and we say the wrong thing to the dark and it remembers. Some mornings one of us holds a mug like a ceremony and the other one stands behind him and says what needs saying. I still do sound, he still does light. Between us there is a kind of stage we intend to keep. And the switches of this city, if you'll believe me, keep learning the trick of lining themselves for a few hours at a time without complaint.